If you open a medieval book on magic, chances are you'll immediately develop an inferiority complex. Every page stares back at you with ominous circles, triangles sprouting mysterious tails, and an alphabet that looks as though a cat walked across the keyboard after spilling ink over it. For centuries, we were told that these strange marks formed a sacred code for summoning horned beings who apparently suffer from a chronic shortage of conversation in hell. Let's dust the mothballs off this subject. A magical symbol is neither an object of blind faith nor a passport into a fantasy world. It is humanity's oldest graphical user interface. The human brain is wonderfully efficient and wonderfully lazy. It rarely thinks in paragraphs. It thinks in ready-made images. Symbols were invented as the desktop icons of the subconscious. When a magician traces a rune through the air or meditates upon the Egyptian Eye of Horus, they are doing exactly what you do when you tap the banking app on your phone. At that moment, you are not thinking about millions of lines of code, servers humming away in Frankfurt, or layers of encryption protocols. You simply want to transfer money to your mother. A symbol works in precisely the same way. It is a shortcut that opens an immense compressed archive of knowledge, emotions, memories, and behavioral patterns. The history of magical symbols is not the chronicle of humanity's collective madness. It is the fascinating evolution of our cognitive software. From the first prehistoric likes carved onto cave walls, to the uncompromising psychoanalysis of the early 20th century, where ancient demons were finally invited onto the therapist's couch and politely expected to pay for the session. Today, we will follow humanity's remarkable journey of learning how to compress an entire universe into a single graphic click, and why modern programmers and interface designers should probably light a candle in grateful memory of the medieval occultists who invented the concept long before the first computer ever existed. The history of magical software began the moment our prehistoric ancestor grew tired of chasing dinner across the landscape and decided to negotiate with it remotely instead. That was the birth of cave painting, the world's very first Instagram. Prehistoric symbolism was almost embarrassingly straightforward. There was no metaphysics involved. If a cave wall showed a bison pierced by a spear, it was not an allegory of an existential crisis. It was a perfectly clear search query addressed to the universe. I'd like some meat, preferably today. The magic of that age was imitative. Our ancestors genuinely believed that a copy could influence the original. Draw the mammoth, poke it with a spear, collect enthusiastic likes from the rest of the tribe. And with engagement now soaring, it was finally time to go hunting for the real thing. This was the very first version of the interface, where the image and the object were considered one and the same. Centuries passed. Humanity built cities, invented taxes, and eventually realized that drawing an entire mammoth every single time was terribly inefficient. Then came ancient Egypt, where symbolism made a giant leap forward. Instead of merely copying nature, people began creating ideograms, signs capable of encoding abstract ideas. The Egyptians became history's first great UX designers of meaning. They compressed vast cosmic principles into elegant visual icons. The Ankh, the looped cross, became the shortcut for eternal life. The Eye of Wadjet, or the Eye of Horus, functioned as the ultimate security icon, an ancient antivirus protecting both the king and the soul. Egyptian magic, however, was also built upon an extraordinary culture of documentation. The Egyptians treated the afterlife as an immensely sophisticated legal procedure. They covered pyramids and tombs with hieroglyphs, not out of romantic sentiment, but because they needed a perfectly completed set of documents for the final audit before Osiris. Draw a protective symbol incorrectly on your papyrus, and your eternal paperwork would effectively be rejected. Your cosmic tax return would be denied, and your soul could be legally devoured by the monster Amit. At the same time, another remarkable idea was taking shape. By carefully observing the heavens, the Egyptians were among the first to recognize that events in the sky, the macrocosm, were mysteriously reflected in the flooding of the Nile and the fertility of the land, the microcosm. But if one wished not merely to observe these correspondences, but to work with them more efficiently, an even more compact symbolic language was needed. And then, the Phoenicians entered the stage. Pragmatic merchants, they had very little interest in the bureaucracy of the afterlife. What they truly cared about was calculating the profits from selling purple dye and cedar wood as quickly as possible. Around 1050 BC, they launched perhaps the boldest IT revolution of the ancient world. They invented the first phonetic alphabet. Before the Phoenicians, writing a simple sentence like, "I sold 30 cows," required the talents of a professionally trained artist who could convincingly draw horns, hooves, tails, and the occasional disgruntled cow. The Phoenicians finally said, "Enough of this nonsense," and promptly fired the Egyptian designers. They created a system of just 22 letters, where each sign no longer represented a physical object. Instead, every symbol encoded a sound. It was a tectonic shift, not only for magic, but for human thought itself. The symbol was finally liberated from the material world and entered the realm of pure abstraction. With only a couple of dozen simple characters, a human being could now describe, imagine, program, and ultimately bring into existence things that had never existed anywhere in nature. This was the true birth of the magic of the word. Letters became the elementary particles from which incantations, ideas, philosophies, and entire civilizations could now be assembled, each with the power to reshape reality. While Phoenician merchants were happily calculating their profits in the warm Mediterranean, people in the harsh north of Europe were facing problems far more serious than taxation. It was cold, it was dark, and every now and then something unpleasant wandered out of the forest. Wolves, or perhaps frost giants. Under those conditions, Egyptian cats and elegant hieroglyphs were of little practical use. What was needed was a tool as dependable as an axe and as precise as a Swiss watch. That is how the runes emerged, the magical language of the north, eventually organized into the Elder Futhark, an alphabet of 24 symbols. Forget the fantasy novels where runes are portrayed as the whisper of ancient gods. Strip away the later medieval legends, and Scandinavian symbolism reveals something surprisingly modern. Geometry, structure, and the physics of consciousness. Look closely at the runes. You will not find a single circle or flowing curve, only vertical lines and sharply angled branches. Why? Well, first, try carving a perfect circle into frozen oak with a rusty knife. More importantly, however, their geometry is profoundly functional. Every rune is essentially a vector diagram, indicating the direction in which a particular force moves. Unlike the Egyptian cosmos, the Norse universe did not begin with an elegant act of creation. It began with a thermodynamic catastrophe, the collision of absolute fire, Muspelheim, and absolute ice, Niflheim. Runes became the language used to describe what happens to matter and to consciousness under that kind of pressure. Isa, a single vertical line represents absolute ice, crystallization, contraction, stillness, and the suspension of movement. Psychologically, it may signify perfect mental discipline or complete emotional paralysis. Hagalaz represents hail, the sudden destruction of existing structures by forces beyond our control. It is objective reality arriving uninvited to demolish our comforting illusions. Norse magic required no intermediaries. A rune did not encode the name of a deity who needed to be persuaded through prayer. It encoded a law of nature. To carve a rune onto a shield was to activate a specific physical or psychological algorithm. Direct the force of impact here. Block fear along this axis. No sentimentality, just structural engineering for the human mind. We're divided into 3 groups of 8, known as the Ets. This was far more than a convenient list. It was an astonishingly sophisticated model of psychological evolution. The Et of Freya, the basic operating system. The journey begins with Fehu, the rune of cattle and wealth. Here the task is simple: survive, build stability, accumulate resources, and find one's place within society. The cycle concludes with Wunjo, comfort, harmony, and genuine joy. The Et of Hagalaz, crisis management. Comfort ends here. Life begins throwing hailstones. Hagalaz shatters certainty. Northes teaches necessity, limitation, and endurance. This is the magic of maturity, where growth arrives wearing the mask of hardship. The Et of Tyr, the spiritual upgrade. At this stage, a person finally stops thinking only about security and possessions. The sequence opens with Tiwas, the rune of courage, justice, disciplined will, and the conscious willingness to sacrifice oneself for a higher purpose. From there, the individual moves toward a profound transformation of character. The Scandinavians suspended this entire runic architecture upon the framework of the world tree, Yggdrasil. For our purposes, however, it is far more than a mythical tree inhabited by squirrels. It is a 3-dimensional map of psychological reality. The 9 worlds of Yggdrasil form an elegant model of the human mind. At the highest level lies Asgard, the realm of ideals, higher consciousness, and what modern psychology might call the higher self. At the deepest level rests Helheim, the unconscious, where instinct, fear, memory, and the awareness of mortality reside. Between them stands Midgard, our waking ego, the interface struggling every day to maintain a fragile equilibrium between lofty aspirations and ancient animal instincts, while desperately hoping the entire system doesn't crash into a psychological blue screen of death. Humanity had learned to encode the forces of nature into the rigorous geometry of the runes. But an even greater breakthrough still lay ahead. The next step would be to unite the structural precision of the North with the mystical traditions of the Near East and transform symbols into something resembling fractal source code for reality itself. And if you've ever survived a course in structural mechanics, you'll understand the next chapter almost immediately. Because medieval Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, especially as developed by the 16th century genius Isaac Luria, is essentially electrical engineering and systems analysis, simply written in ancient Hebrew. Before Kabbalah, symbolic systems remained largely local. The Egyptians encoded death, kingship, and the bureaucracy of eternity. The Scandinavians encoded vectors of force and survival. The Kabbalists, however, decided to attempt something considerably more ambitious. They set out to design nothing less than a complete blueprint of reality. The result was the Tree of Life, a fractal map of consciousness composed of 10 Sephiroth connected by 22 pathways. In modern language, it was the first truly universal motherboard for the cosmos. Isaac Luria transformed Kabbalistic thought by asking one deceptively simple question. If reality was designed perfectly, why does everything seem so broken? Like any competent engineer, he eventually located the fault. The problem wasn't in the design. It occurred during system startup. Luria called this event Sheverat HaKelim, the shattering of the vessels. Imagine the creator attempting to feed 1 billion volts into the electrical wiring of a brand new apartment building. The first 3 circuits, the highest levels of consciousness, Kita, Chokma, and Bina, managed to withstand the current. But once that unimaginable energy flowed downward into the rest of the network, the system inevitably short-circuited. The vessels, the Sephiroth, could no longer contain the overwhelming intensity of the light. They shattered. Fragments flew in every direction, and the first cosmic blackout began. Most of the divine light returned safely to its source, but countless fragments of the shattered vessels fell downward, carrying sparks of that light with them. As they descended, those broken shells hardened into the material world itself. These fractured shells became what Kabbalah calls the Qliphoth, literally shells or husks. Without the language of religion, the Qliphoth can be understood as informational noise, corruption within the original source code, or locked files buried deep inside the subconscious. A Qliphoth is fundamentally parasitic. The shell possesses no energy of its own. It survives only because a stolen fragment of divine light, a nitzotz or sacred spark, remains trapped inside it. The shells endlessly hunger for energy. Psychologically, they manifest as compulsions, fears, narcissism, addictions, rigid defense mechanisms, and the countless neuroses that quietly shape human behavior. If you lose yourself in blind, uncontrollable rage, you have connected to Golachab, where the healthy force of discipline has expanded into destructive fire. If you become convinced that the next phone, the next promotion, or the next purchase will finally make you whole, congratulations. You've wandered into Nihimuth, where the shell has completely obscured the deeper purpose hidden beneath material existence. So, what do we do with all this? Luria's answer was Tikkun Olam, the repair of the world. This is not primarily about kneeling in prayer. It is about performing the largest system defragmentation project imaginable. According to Kabbalah, the human being is not a passive servant. Humanity is a team of remote systems engineers. Our task is to perform conscious actions that gradually release those imprisoned sparks of light from the psychological debris surrounding them. Every time you become aware of a destructive pattern, understand it, work through it, and transform weakness into wisdom, another spark is set free. When the final spark is eventually liberated from every shell, the Qliphoth, the informational noise feeding upon them, will lose their source of power, collapse, and reality itself will recover its original harmony. While the Kabbalists were busy defragmenting the universe in the Near East, one extraordinarily curious Englishman of the Renaissance looked at the Tree of Life and quietly thought, "This is impressive, but I wonder if we could use it to establish communication with non-human intelligence." Welcome to the early modern age, an era when magic finally moved out of damp caves and into university studies, royal libraries, and exclusive gentlemen's societies. Symbols evolved into increasingly sophisticated source code. and magicians themselves began looking remarkably like software engineers backed by venture capital. John Dee and Edward Kelly, a 16th century quantum computer, and one extremely toxic freelancer. Let's begin with John Dee, official astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I, brilliant mathematician, cartographer, and one of the Crown's most trusted intelligence agents. His confidential reports to the Queen were famously signed with the code 007. 3 centuries later, Ian Fleming merely borrowed someone else's intellectual property. And history possesses a delightful sense of irony. When Aleister Crowley, 300 years later, published his great book of correspondences under the title 777, one cannot help wondering whether poor John Dee's Enochian diagrams had simply been missing 2 additional 7s to complete the cosmic defragmentation process. Dee eventually grew dissatisfied with ordinary geometry. He wanted something far more ambitious, an interface capable of communicating directly with cosmic intelligence. To accomplish this, he partnered with Edward Kelly, a professional medium gifted with the extraordinary ability to perceive things inside crystal spheres that no one else could see, and with the equally remarkable absence of both ears. They had been removed after his conviction for counterfeiting, a perfectly respectable addition to the resume of any ambitious Renaissance startup founder. Together, they developed what we now call Enochian magic. Without the religious language, it can be viewed as an attempt to construct history's first quantum computer. The Enochian alphabet, consisting of 21 characters, was not simply an alphabet. Each symbol functioned more like a geometric operator. Dee filled enormous letter tables, known as the tablets, that look uncannily similar to modern Excel spreadsheets. The names of angels were extracted by following elaborate chess-like paths across those grids. Writing an Enochian word became the equivalent of executing a program designed to modify the architecture of reality itself. Unfortunately, the project collapsed because of the oldest software bug in human history: people. Kelly, behaving very much like an exceptionally toxic freelancer, eventually grew tired of endless calculations and announced that the angels had delivered an unexpected update. According to Heaven, the 2 partners were now expected to share absolutely everything, including their wives. In a magnificently British twist of history, Dee reluctantly agreed, for the sake of science. Curiously, shortly afterward, the angels stopped returning anyone's messages. Kelly eventually died attempting to escape from a prison tower, and the code remained unfinished. Samuel Mathers, wizard duels in Scottish kilts. By the end of the 19th century, John Dee's unfinished code was rediscovered by Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, one of the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Mathers suffered from what might politely be described as terminal romanticism. He insisted that he descended from an ancient Scottish clan. He attended order meetings wearing a kilt, carrying an enormous broadsword, and confidently informed everyone that his instructions came directly from mysterious secret chiefs residing somewhere in the astral dimensions. Odd as he undoubtedly appeared, Mathers was a brilliant systems integrator. He accomplished what today would be called a cross-platform architecture. He combined Kabbalah, tarot, runes, astrology, and John Dee's Enochian system into a single operating environment. You might even call it Golden Dawn OS. More importantly, Mathers produced the first detailed map of what could be described as the psychological minefields hidden within the human mind, the geography of the Qliphothic tree. He taught his students that demons were not horned monsters lurking in dark corners of reality. They were unbalanced psychological forces already living inside ourselves. To make those inner dangers easier to recognize, Mathers created visual signatures, sigils, for every psychological trap, so that the magician would always know exactly what he was confronting. Aleister Crowley, Demythologizing Magic, and Putting Demons on the Therapist's Couch. The final chapter in this remarkable evolution belongs to Aleister Crowley, the undisputed bad boy of the occult world. Crowley staged what could only be described as a magical rap battle inside the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, accused Mathers of running outdated software, rewrote the entire operating system according to his own philosophy, Thelema, and eventually published his legendary reference work, 777. In many respects, 777 is the periodic table of the human psyche. Crowley completed the process of separating symbolism from religion. His conclusion was astonishingly simple. Whether you meditate upon an Egyptian deity, a Norse rune, or a Kabbalistic sephira, you are ultimately activating the very same archetypal structures within the unconscious mind. In this sense, Crowley arrived at Freud and Jung from the opposite direction. They approached the psyche through psychology. He approached it through a magical interface. For Crowley, working with the dark side of the tree, the Qliphoth, became a form of extreme psychoanalysis. His message was radical. Do not sprinkle holy water on your demons. Recognize them, feed them, integrate them. If your greatest struggle lies within Gamaliel, the realm of obsessive desire and forbidden fantasies, excellent. What you possess is not merely temptation. It is an enormous reservoir of creative libido. Suppress it, and sooner or later it will return disguised as neurosis. Transform it consciously through the discipline of will, and the very same force becomes creative power. If Golachab fills you with anger, even better. Forge that fire into discipline, clarity, and the courage to defend your own boundaries. Crowley embedded this principle into every illustration of his Thoth tarot. His moon is not a gentle romantic nightscape. It is a crimson psychic swamp where consciousness risks losing itself unless guided by a disciplined will. His tower is not simply catastrophe. It is the painful but absolutely necessary demolition of those rigid psychological defenses, the very Qliphothic shells that we have mistaken for our true identity. In the end, Crowley stripped magic of much of its mythology and revealed it as a remarkably sophisticated form of psychological engineering. The ancient demons quietly surrendered their tridents, lay down on the psychoanalyst's couch, and became integrated members of the human self. Having traveled from the cave-painted bison to the Thoth tarot, humanity arrived at a remarkable realization. A symbol is the language through which the unconscious mind speaks to objective reality. The ancient magicians, the Kabbalists, and the rune masters were never irrational fanatics. They were the world's first programmers. Lacking computers, they tested their software on the only processor available, their own minds. They created visual shortcuts that reduced the cognitive load of consciousness, while providing immediate access to the deeper architecture of the psyche. Today, every time we tap an icon on a smartphone, write software, or explore our dreams through Jungian analysis, we are using precisely the same cognitive algorithms that were once refined inside ancient temples and secret initiatory orders. The source code of the human mind has never fundamentally changed. The only question is this: have you learned to use its interface? Or are your own inner Qliphoth still quietly running the system from the shadows? We began our search believing that magic was hidden inside symbols, gods, rituals, and ancient books. Yet all along, we were really studying the history of human thought, the story of how the mind gradually invented its own interfaces to understand both the universe and itself. And here, our story reaches its conclusion. Like the old letters of another age, only one final note remains. Sometimes the postscript turns out to be the most important part of the letter, until we meet again in the final episode. Oh, and before I forget, if you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the channel and perhaps leave a like. My name is Desiro. Thank you for traveling with me.